How to Take Smart Notes. Again, this book changed my life 3 years ago. This is my second read through. Key idea in this whole book is that connection is learning. But if you just want the TLDR, take 3 different types of notes: fleeting, permanent, and project notes. I like to do a fourth called journal. And that it's really like, this is your tool here, the slip box. And the technique is really about just writing to learn, to understand, to find the gaps in your knowledge, to connect things, to look at the differences between things, and build things from the bottom up and really trust yourself. And all this note taking is to foster learning. Learning is understanding. Understanding is connection, connecting to your existing body of knowledge, to the ideas, to the work you have. That is the gist. These are my notes that I took from the rest of the video. If this book sounds interesting to you, stick around and I will break down all the highlights and notes that I took. So coming to the first highlight, having a clear structure to work in is completely different from making plans about something. If you make a plan, you impose a structure on yourself. It makes you inflexible. To keep going according to your plan, you have to push yourself and employ willpower. This is not only demotivating, but also unsuitable for an open-ended process like research, thinking, or studying in general, where we have to adjust our next steps with every new insight. Now, this resonated deeply with me because I am very much a disciplined, follow my plan kind of person. And I've been doing a lot of reading on the work of Carl Jung, mainly through James Hollis as well, on trusting my intuition more. Like when a plan's not working, when I'm too flexible, or rather when I'm being too inflexible, to be able to adapt and to try things and to listen to myself and to pivot, and that it's okay. I had a conversation with a colleague the other day at work, and I talked about how I read now. Now I'll start 10 different books at once and then just rotate through them as I feel inspired to one, rather than taking one book and trying to read it end to end, which often used to happen to me. Was I'd get stuck on that book and not want to continue, and then I just wouldn't even read. Now, like trusting myself more, which I think is wisdom that comes with maturity, is like, I know I'm going to get stuff done. So it's okay if I put something down or quit it early. And so, for this book here, like I could easily get lost in planning and then be stuck to that plan. So what I'm trying to do more now of is just having the space to kind of work on something. And so the book continues that the challenge is to structure one's workflow in a way that insight and new ideas can become the driving forces that push us forward. We do not want to make ourselves dependent on a plan that is threatened by the unexpected. And so again, I think that just comes back to this idea of giving yourself space to work rather than having rigid plans. The book says, this book is for you, the good students, ambitious academics, and knowledge workers who understand that insight doesn't come easy and that writing is not only for proclaiming opinions, but the main tool to achieve insight worth sharing. And now I've gone back and forth a lot about why I bother writing, why I make content. I'm more focused on learning, being a doer. My day job is a research engineer. I'm learning so much with AI and there's a lot of projects I want to do there, but why make content? Why write? And so I've realized there's kind of 2 different ways, or for me at least, I see there's 2 different modes of writing. There's like the published writing for others, where you're trying to help and share ideas. And then there's the writing I do for myself. And it took me a while to separate those 2. But having disambiguated those, I think it's much easier. And then coming back to that structure point, when I give myself a structure like a second brain here, it makes it easy to give myself space to write, to think, and then like maybe clean it up and write to share. But I'm starting to do less of that only if I feel like I really want to synthesize information, which as we get to, you'll see is a key part of this book. Now, the book continues that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We only need to combine 2 well-known and proven ideas. The first idea at the heart of this book is the technique of the simple slip box, which we'll get to. The second idea is equally important. Even the best tool will not improve your productivity considerably if you don't change your daily routines. And so I'm going to stop right here, but I think this is two key things I want to add is the idea of the slip box being the one thing, and then the technique being the other. And now I actually have a note in my second brain about tool and technique, and I think this is a key idea where it's, you can have all the tools you want, but if you don't know how to use them well, they're not nearly as effective and you might even be hurting yourself there. So I think that's a key idea. And one of the things I realized in reflecting on this was like, isn't that going to make me go slower having to learn a new technique? Yeah, absolutely. But you're unlocking potentially compounding, improvements down the road. Okay. Next highlight here, referring to Nicholas Luhmann. He not only stressed that he never forced himself to do something he didn't feel like, he even said, I only do what is easy. I only write when I immediately know how to do it. If I falter for a moment, I put the matter aside and do something else. Even hard work can be fun as long as it is aligned with our intrinsic goals and we feel in control. The problems arise when we set up our work in such an inflexible way that we can't adjust it when things change and become arrested in a process that seems to develop a life of its own. And now I think this is a key point under the technique bubble, as we've already discussed. But it's really like, oh boy, why is that moving? just a key idea there, like coming back to that earlier point about trusting yourself and being flexible. Studies on the book continues. Studies on highly successful people have proven again and again that success is not the result of strong willpower and the ability to overcome resistance, but rather the result of smart working environments that avoid resistance in the first place. And I think that, again, is tying this whole idea of having structure, but like being flexible within this structure and giving yourself space to work that doesn't tie you down. All right, now getting to the slip box in general. Strictly speaking, Luhmann had two slip boxes, a bibliographical one, which contained references and brief notes of the content he consumed. And then the second step shortly after that was he would look at his brief notes and think about their relevance for his own thinking and writing. He would then turn to the main slip box and write his ideas, comments, and thoughts on a new piece of paper, using only one for each idea. This idea of an atomic note, which I don't really follow because it's hard sometimes to do that, but that's what my plugin OpenAugie tries to help you do, is cut things into atomic ideas so it becomes easier to match them across your second brain. He usually kept them brief enough to fit on one paper. But the idea is really like the slip box is really two key folders. It's the reference notes, the stuff you capture from things you read that you put in your own words, and then like your main notes, things that you write because you sat there and thought about it. And then essentially you can have another element, which is an index, like a way to like link into other big topics of notes. The book says writing notes accompanies the main work, and done right, it helps with that. And I try to consider this as like this note taking is like a byproduct of your learning, right? If you want to learn something for the long run, the book says you have to write it down. If you want to really understand something, you have to translate it into your own words. No matter how internal processes are implemented, you need to understand the extent to which the mind is reliant on this external scaffolding. If there's one thing experts agree on, then it is this. You have to externalize your ideas. You have to write. Richard Feynman stresses it as much as Benjamin Franklin. And again, I think this is the appeal to writing to me, but making that distinction between like writing for yourself versus writing for others. Write to think, get your thoughts down, to play with this stuff, like make it messy, this sort of stream of conscious kind of journaling or note taking, and then kind of sift through and do it. For me right now, this like recording of the notes and verbalizing them, like the transcript becomes my sort of messy thinking of putting into my own words. And then, trying to do this mind map live is a little tricky. I think once I get it all out there, it might be easier to play with the pieces. But, I wanted to try this live right now. The book continues, how to write a paper step by step. You make fleeting notes. Always have something on hand to write with. The idea is make capture seamless. Like I think that's a really key idea. That's something I mainly keep Obsidian on my phone. Sometimes I use Otter to take voice notes. For reference, I use Readwise and Snipped when I'm listening to podcasts. And then I sync all those into my Obsidian. Step 2 is then to make literature notes. Curate what you're reading. Whenever you read something, make notes about it. Put them in your own words. Don't just copy a bunch of stuff. You want to be the curator there of what you're putting in. And then step 3 is to make permanent notes. Now this is the part I've struggled with, but you turn to your slip box, you go through the notes you made in step 1 and 2, ideally a few times a week, once a day, something like that. Find a rhythm that works for you. This is, my new way of trying to synthesize information, is making these videos about books I read, because again, they would just sit there with the words, with all the notes in the book. So you make permanent notes. And then this, when you're doing this permanent note step, this is the thinking. This is the taking the time to think about what you just read, how it relates to your work, how it relates to other things. And this is where Obsidian or other tools like Second Brain kind of knowledge management tools really become powerful, is because you start to link them to new ideas, or existing ideas rather. And then continuing with this idea of how to write a paper is like, after a while, you've developed these ideas and you've added stuff to the permanent notes, things are linking together. You can start to see where the clusters form. And that becomes the topic you write something about, because you've sort of naturally followed your curiosity between capturing fleeting notes with what you thought about, reading things and taking those literature notes, or listening to things. Okay, so as you see, I gave up on the mind map idea. It was just too slow. I found myself typing more and I wanted to link to the notes. So now moving into chapter 3 here. Again, the slip box provides an external scaffold to think in. We saw that earlier, that you kind of need that. Okay, so coming back to this idea of tools and technique, chapter 4, a few things to keep in mind. Tools are only as good as your ability to work with them. Everybody knows how to handle a flute. You blow into one end and press your fingers on the holes according to the notes you're playing, but nobody would try it once and then judge the instrument on what they hear. That is a great analogy. I think that is why second brains, taking notes, having your own productivity system are so personal and so daunting, is because like you have to give yourself permission to constantly experiment. And I think that's one thing I've personally been doing a lot more of, is like I have this meta note here that like I keep trying things. And sometimes I use a tag And again, this is not maybe my thought, but like constantly experiment because you have to get the technique to work for you in the tool. So you figure out what's working for you. So now into chapter 5, writing is the only thing that matters. There's no such thing as private knowledge in academia. An idea kept private is as good as one you never had. So this is why I've put up my own public second brain. So it's part of my second brain. I have it in a separate folder. But like I started to journal a little bit more in public. I have the AI generate some things from my notes. I share some things. These are a little bit more cleaned up. This is where maybe my more polished notes go that I synthesize. But I like this idea of working in public. It's stuck with me for a while. And I think that's part of why I like to write. Okay, so now further into this chapter, there's this idea of focusing on writing as if nothing else counts. Makes you do everything else differently. It goes on to say, having a clear, tangible purpose when you attend a lecture, discussion, or seminar will make you more engaged and sharpen your focus. And I think this relates to this idea of just-in-time learning. It's like, rather than just read or consume something because you want to, when you go at it with a question and you have a clear point in mind, it becomes easier to get that answer. You're more primed to look for it. You will become more focused on the relevant aspects. It will change the way you read as well. You will read in a more engaged way because you cannot rephrase anything in your own words if you don't understand what it is about. I think that's like key to the Feynman technique as well, putting things into your own words, but having a clear question in mind. Okay, into chapter 6 now, simplicity is paramount. In the beginning, the perception was very much shaped by what worked before, and only the most immediate effects were visible. This is kind of a tangential idea when he's talking about a story around shipping containers. I can't remember why this one jumped out to me, though. Maybe something along the lines of research here, where it was thinking like, I'm relatively new to the field of AI, and I'm coming in it as a former day trader turned data engineer, now a research engineer on a time series foundation model team. So I think that, to me, like having a different perception, like a different outsider perspective, not knowing what came before necessarily, is an advantage when you're doing research or trying to try new ideas. So I think that's why that stood out to me. Just as a passage, I think I'll put that in like a different section here. It's not really related to the main idea of the book. Okay, so now continuing in this chapter, even though the slipbox being organized bottom up does not face the trade-off problem between too many or too few topics, it can lose its value when notes are added to it indiscriminately. And yes, that's a problem I've struggled with, and that is what I'm hoping to improve this year. And that's why I wanted to read this book a second time now, 3 years later. To achieve a critical mass, it is crucial to distinguish clearly between 3 types of notes. And this is key. This is up here now. Fleeting notes, which are only reminders of information, can be written in any kind of way and will end up in the trash within a day or two. Now, for me, this is the easy capture. This is Obsidian on my phone, Otter for voice notes. This is where I have OpenAugie, my Obsidian plugin, split notes by a special token, which I use QQQ, or I say pork chop in a voice note, just because that's easy for the transcription to always get correct. So that makes it easy to capture, but then it helps me with like the processing stage. So whatever you need to do to catch those notes, but then you need to be processed. Permanent notes now, which will never be thrown away, contain the necessary information in a permanently understandable way. They are always stored in the same way in the same place, either as literature notes in the reference system or in the slip box. And so permanent notes, I guess we're saying now, like this is where you have both, maybe I'll move this under here. You have the literature and then you have like your main, like your notes, like I'll just call it that there. And then these are like in your own words, of course, but that's how they're kind of structured. And then it talks about project notes. All right, so then we go to 3 project notes, which are only relevant to one particular project. They are kept within a project-specific folder and can be discarded or archived after the project is finished. And so Tiago has this notion of, like in Para, there's areas which never end and projects which are a clear ending. And so to me, that's what that means. And then it's not in here, but I definitely use my second brain for journal notes. And that's kind of like my messy reflections. That goes into a separate folder for me, but that is my 4th type of note. Just not part of the book, but if we're doing a full encompassing PKM system, that's what I do there. Continuing the book, if you already know that you will not go back to it, then don't take those kind of notes. Take proper notes instead. Fleeting notes are only useful if you review them within a day or two, so you can turn them into proper notes later. Luhmann never underlined sentences in the text he read or wrote comments in the margins. All he did was take brief notes about the ideas that caught his attention in text on a separate piece of paper. And so now, like I think I'll add here, these need to be processed. But this reminds me of an idea. This reminds me of an idea from Justin Sung on YouTube, where he has some good videos about mind mapping, but then also like that it's better to let things sit in your brain more. So like thinking of Luhmann never highlighting things or underlining things, he's reading, taking in a bunch of information, holding that in his head, and then writing something about it rather than just underlining as you go. I'm definitely in that former camp where I underline as I go. But this idea also came from Justin here, which is like hold information in your head longer and then write about it. Okay, now continuing the book, I have a note in the margin here about quality and using a few good books or a few good notes. I can't remember exactly which passage triggered that, but that is definitely a concept or idea I have quite a bit where I'm sure you've heard it, like you should just read the same few books over and over again. The more I've done that, the more I've spent time with the same information, the more I actually learn and retain and understand, the more it actually helps me rather than just being so focused on consuming over and over again, taking time to sit there and synthesize things. And I think that comes back to this earlier idea of like, yes, isn't that going to be slower? Yeah, that's the idea. Go slower with a few good things that resonate, and you're actually going to learn something or internalize something, have an idea and really have it make a stamp or impact on your life rather than just consuming a bunch of stuff that you don't do anything with. There's no point to doing that. I think that's a tough concept to learn. Okay, so now into chapter 7 here. Nobody ever starts from scratch. And the idea in this chapter roughly is like starting with a blank screen of paper is very intimidating when you go to work. So just be collecting your notes all the time. The second brain makes life easy. I have a highlight here that if we look into our slipbox to see where clusters have built up, we not only see possible topics, but topics we have already worked on, even if we were not able to see it up front. And I think this comes as part of the technique maybe of trusting your intuition and energy. Look for where clusters build up. This idea of bottom up is kind of related again to this idea of being flexible, trusting your curiosity, not like doing what we did in grade school. The book makes this argument too, where you think, what should my topic be? And let me go research it. Here we're saying like, go explore something, go do what you're interested in, take notes as you go, and eventually you'll have something good to write about. In chapter 8, let the work carry you forward. That's sort of I think this idea encapsulated in the title. Creating satisfying, repeatable experiences with sports. It doesn't matter what her clients are doing, running, walking, team sports, gym workouts, or bicycling to work. The only thing that matters is that they discover something that gives them a good experience that they would like to have again. Once her clients find something, they are encouraged enough to try something as well. They enter the virtuous cycle where willpower isn't needed anymore because they feel like doing it anyway. This is referring to a motivational coach, Michelle Seeger, in the book, where the idea is like, find something you like, it becomes easy to keep doing it. And having a growth mindset from Carol Dweck, actively seeking and welcoming feedback, whether positive or negative, is one of the most important factors for success in the long run. I think the idea here is just like you want things to work for you. You want to make it easy to keep coming back to them. Certainly, as I've gotten older, I've changed many routines and habits that no longer work for me. And I think I've worked out my entire life pretty consistently, but it's evolved over time, and it's always been something that like works for me. And I think when it comes to most things, find the system that works for you, find your balance here. And I know that's tricky because like we're talking about tools and techniques, but the idea is like it needs to be self-reinforcing, and it shouldn't feel like you're grinding your teeth or disciplining yourself. So you have to make those adjustments to meet you where you are, but to make the thing you want to do more effortless. And I guess that kind of comes to like habits and James Clear's kind of work. Moving ahead, jumping ahead to another idea here. Reading with a pen in hand, for example, forces us to think about what we read and check upon our understanding. It is the simplest test. We tend to think we understand what we read until we try to rewrite it into our own words. And this is the gist of like why I write in the Feynman technique, because this is how you, teaching others, you put it into your own words, it forces you to really learn deep. And I think this is so true. And this is a lot of like how I ramped up on AI in the past year or so, was doing this kind of work in public, whether on GitHub or just taking notes as I read. And again, this is what this kind of video is for me now as well. Okay, in chapter 9 now, there's a subsection, become an expert instead of a planner. The moment we stop making plans is the moment we start to learn. It is a matter of practice to become good at generating insight and write good text by choosing and moving flexibly between the most important and promising tasks. Judged by nothing else than the circumstances of a given situation. Experts rely on embodied experience. And then there's another note I have highlighted on the same page, but they are keeping you from learning the very academia, and writing is all about gaining insight and making it public. To become an expert, we need the freedom to make our own decisions and all the necessary mistakes that help us learn. But something like bicycling, it can only be learned by doing. Most study guides in academic writing are teachers trying very hard to spare you from that experience by telling you what, when, and how to write instead. But they are really preventing you from doing the learning. And so like, I think this resonated with me because like I'm an over planner. So like spending one of the things I've been working on is like just getting into it more, just writing, just doing things. That's why this video is a little crude perhaps, but yeah, defaulting to action, I think is like a key idea here. And that's something I've been thinking about for a while. I already have it here. Imperfect action better than over planning. I think that's kind of the same idea. Again, this idea of making stuff public. All right, another highlight here. Because trainees lack the experience to judge a situation correctly and confidently, they need to stick to the rules they were taught, much to the delight of their teachers. According to the Dreyfuses, the correct application of teachable rules enables you to become a competent performer, which corresponds to a 3 on their 5-grade expert scale, but it won't make you a master and certainly won't turn you into an expert. Experts, on the other hand, have internalized the necessary knowledge. They don't have to actively remember the rules or think consciously about the choices. They've acquired enough experience in various situations to be able to rely on their intuition. And I think this comes back to, again, like trusting our expertise. You learn through experience, you learn by doing. Okay, and then the chapter continues, though. Have a look at the following number sequence only once and try to remember it right away. 11, 95, 82, 19, 62, 31. That's difficult as it's clearly more than 7 digits, but it is quite easy when you realize that these are just 5 years of the World Cup numbered consecutively. Now you only have to remember 2 things, the rule and the starting year. That's why it's so much easier to remember things we understand than things we don't. It is not that we have to choose to focus either on learning or understanding. It's always about understanding. And if it's only for the sake of learning, things we understand are connected either through rules, theories, narratives, pure logic, mental models, or explanations. And deliberately building these kinds of meaningful connections is what the slip box is all about. Yes, this I think is a huge rule. This idea of it's all about understanding. Actually, this is probably going to get its own section here. And we learn that by connecting things. When you can relate to something, when you can connect to it, that's how you remember it. An example from the book that I remember, I think it was this book, was discussing med students. Do they learn that they memorize facts that like arteries are more elastic than veins, for example? Like, do you have to memorize that property? And it's, well, yeah, you could sit there and memorize that. And that arteries, A stands for away, carries blood away from the heart. Or you could just remember that when the heart beats and the blood is leaving the heart, it is leaving with a higher pressure in that system. So those arteries need to be more elastic to withstand that pressure, because it's the first thing, that like the heart beats, it forcefully pushes out the blood. So your arteries need to be more elastic. If you understand that, you don't have to memorize arteries are more elastic than veins. And I thought that was a good idea. And I think this works really well for just like learning anything in tech or and when you're learning in public. When I make these videos, I have to distill things down in a way that like clear that I understand them, make things more simpler. And that forces me to go deep into my thinking. And I think that comes back to like, you're very much related to like the Feynman technique, putting things in your own word. But a key idea about understanding is making this connection. So like while understanding is the important, making the connections is like what really helps there. Yes. And so like related to that now in chapter 10, Luhmann describes the step of taking literature notes as follows. I always have a slip of paper at hand on which I note down the ideas of certain pages. On the back, I write down the bibliographic details. After finishing the book, I go through my notes and think how these notes might be relevant for already written notes in the slip box. It means that I always read with an eye toward possible connections in the slip box. And I think that again comes back to, this thinking, curating, like what you're capturing. Maybe that's part of the technique, but I can put that under here. Curate, don't just overconsume. That again, relating to like that active just-in-time learning idea. Whenever we explore a new unfamiliar subject, our notes will tend to be more extensive, but we shouldn't get nervous about it, as this is the deliberate practice of understanding we cannot skip. Sometimes it is necessary to slowly work our way through a difficult text, and sometimes it's enough to reduce a whole book to a single sentence. Yeah, go slow, let things marinate, I think is sort of the key idea there. Writing, I have some notes in the morning here. Writing by hand is slower, it forces thinking. The book continues, but to be able to note down the gist of a lecture, you have to understand it in the first place. So if you're writing by hand, you are forced to think about what you hear or read. Otherwise, you'll be able to grasp your underlying principle, the idea, the structure of an argument. And so like, I think this, again, like relates back to this idea here of like, sometimes writing by hand is good. Again, this idea of like distilling things in your own words, having it sit in your brain a little bit more, think about it before you write. So continuing the book, keep an open mind. Confirmation bias. Worse, we are usually not even aware of this confirmation bias. We often spend time with people we like because we like them because they like us, and we tend to agree on things. What sets the best scientists and thinkers apart from others are that they are aware of the problem and they try to do something about confirmation bias. The classic role model here would be Charles Darwin. He forced himself to write down and therefore elaborate on the arguments that are most critical of his theories. I think this is a related new good idea, but yeah, so I think this relates to an earlier note we just started to make on outside perspective, but this idea of human or augmented intelligence, where you can use AI to help like poke holes in your argument and give you that different perspective that you're missing. Sometimes you can ask a role and say, what am I missing here? What am I not seeing? Be this person and like tear apart my argument. So I think that's a good idea, is just being aware of confirmation bias there. Chapter 10 continues, get the gist. The ability to distinguish relevant from less relevant information is another skill that can only be learned by doing. It is the practice of looking for the gist and distinguishing it from mere supporting details. As we are forced to make this distinction when we read with a pen in our hand and write the permanent note after permanent note, it is more than mere practice. It is deliberate practice repeated multiple times a day. So this idea of like, again, thinking about things before you write, having something in mind of what you're looking for, makes it easier, like not just lazily taking notes, but just thinking more about what it is you're after and what's the main point of this argument. It becomes a habit that we can learn. Maybe that goes somewhere in here. Rewriting what was already written almost automatically trains one to shift the attention towards frames, patterns, and categories in the observations or the conditions assumption. So I think it's just a point on taking reference notes. Learn to read. If you can't say it clearly, you don't understand it yourself. Then he goes on to talk about Richard Feynman said that he can, Richard Feynman once said that he can only determine whether he understood something if he gave an introductory lecture on it. The most important advantage of writing that helps us to confront ourselves when we do not understand something as well as we would like to believe. The principle is that you must not fool yourself. You are the easiest person to fool, Feynman stressed in the speech to young scientists. Again, that just comes right back there to Feynman taking, put things into your own word. That's how you find the gaps in your knowledge. Maybe that's here. And then it like forces that understanding. Because now we are faced with a clear choice. We have to choose between feeling smarter or becoming smarter. And while writing down an idea feels like a detour, extra time spent not writing it down is the real waste of time, as it renders most of what we have read as ineffectual. Understanding is not just a precondition of learning something. To a certain degree, learning is understanding, and the mechanisms are not so different either. We can only improve our learning if we test ourselves on our progress. So that like putting in your own words, building on understanding, it's kind of a feedback loop there. Learn by reading. Learning requires effort because we have to think to understand, and we need to actively retrieve old knowledge to convince our brains to connect it with new ideas as cues. I think this comes right back to this idea of connecting things is how you understand and remember the web, like these notes. The chapter continues about reading for understanding. It is not surprising, therefore, that the best research and most successful method is elaboration. It is very similar to what we do when we take smart notes and combine them with others, which is the opposite of mere reviewing. Elaboration means nothing other than really thinking about the meaning of what we read, how it can inform different questions and topics, how it could be combined with other knowledge. In fact, writing for learning is the name of an elaboration method. And I think that's saying like nothing new again. It's really just this idea, maybe this is becoming its like own point where it's like, continuing here on how to take smart notes, writing brief accounts on the main ideas of a text, including instead of collecting quotes. And she also stresses that it's no less important to do something with these ideas, to think about how they connect with other ideas from different contexts and can inform questions that are not already the questions. Again, similar to this idea of like holding stuff in your head, thinking about it before you write, connecting things to what you already have. Like I feel like I'm starting to repeat myself now as this book goes on. But again, this is what resonated with me. It's not the entire book. Here's another point on externalizing. Only in the written form can an argument be looked at with a certain distance. Literally, we need this distance to think about an argument. So again, come back to the idea of externalization. Feynman once protested, no, these notes aren't a record of my thinking process. They are my thinking process. I actually did the work on paper. No, it's not a record. Not really. It is working. You have to work on paper, and this is the paper. So again, Feynman stressing this idea of externalizing thinking by writing. We have that up here, where like you need that medium to get thoughts out there. And I think that comes back to like allowing space to be unstructured so you can just think on paper and separating the idea of writing for yourself versus like writing for an audience or something. You need to get those thoughts out there, and that's what your slipbox is for. Okay, so when it comes to writing permanent notes, think like kind of what I'm doing now. Why did the aspects I wrote down catch my interest? And so that's what I'm hoping to do here is like as I'm going through my highlights, like why did this pique my interest? That's sometimes the stories I run off to the side. So again, another section here about learning. We have seen in the first step that elaboration through taking smart literature notes increases the likelihood that we will remember what we read in the long term. But this is only the first step. Transferring these ideas into the network of our own thoughts, our loudest work of theories, concepts, and mental models in the slipbox brings our thinking to the next level. We have an ongoing dialogue with these ideas where they can be part of our active set of ideas. Yes. So again, same idea here. Externalize things, put them into your own words, transfer them in by connecting, starting to see a pattern. Learning is making meaningful connections. Learning is connecting. That comes up again. Memory artists instead attach meaning to information connected to already known networks of connections in a meaningful way. This is the trick of how people memorize stuff. Yes. Elaboration is nothing more than connecting information to other information in a meaningful way. The first step of elaboration is to think enough about a piece of information so that we're able to write about it. The second step is to think about what it means for the other context as well. Connecting, ask why. So ask the right questions, but elaborating a little bit on why things are different. Ask yourself that. Learned right, which means understanding, which means connecting. There is a reason why the best scientists are often very good teachers. For someone like Richard Feynman, everything was about understanding, regardless of whether he was doing research or teaching. His famous Feynman diagrams, which I underlined because that sounded pretty cool, are primarily tools to make understanding easier. And his lectures are famous because they help students really understand physics. He couldn't stand textbooks full of pseudo-explanations and teachers who try to make learning easier for students by using artificial real-life examples instead of using their actual prior understanding as the connection point. The slip box forces us to ask numerous elaborate questions. What does it mean? How does it connect to this? What's the difference between? What is it similar to? That's the whole idea. So again, this is a really big point. I think this resonated with me. Where did I put that? It's all about making the connection. Yeah. Connection is key here. This becomes maybe its own thing here, but connection is learning. Check, resuming. Develop topics, chapter 12. After adding a note to the slip box, you need to make sure it can be found again. This is what the index is for. Lumen wrote an index with a typewriter on index cards, and in digital system keywords can easily be added to a note like tags and then show up in the index. The references between the notes are much more important than the references from the index to a single note. So again, this idea of having an index as an entry point into your system, tagging things to make it easy to find things, linking things to make it easy to stumble across things again. Consider indexes like entry points into your system. Keywords should always be assigned with an eye towards the topics you are working on or interested in, never by looking at a note in isolation. This is always why the process cannot be automated or delegated to a machine or program. I disagree. I think you can do some context engineering here, but the technology is not quite there yet. But I think you can do some context engineering, give it a taxonomy of your ideas, your projects, and then have an AI suggest where things can be linked to. That's part of what OpenAugie is trying to do for me. Okay, so now some thoughts on linking. The first type of links are those on notes that are giving you an overview of a topic. These can be referred to from the index. These are like the MOC notes or map of contents. They kind of help structure thoughts, and it's totally okay to start one and then just make a new one as the topic evolves. Don't force yourself into too much of a structure than an index. I've done that before. So now chapter 12, another section, compare, correct, and differentiate. Therefore, working with the slip box is disillusioning, but at the same time, it increases the chance that we'll actually move forward in our thinking towards uncharted territory instead of just feeling like we are moving over. So instead of just feeling like why we are moving forward. This is why you externalize, and this is why you take the time to think, is find those gaps or connections or the differences between things that are existing in there. Continuing the book, Charlie Munger, he advocates looking out for the most powerful concepts in every discipline and to try to understand them so thoroughly that they become part of our thinking. The moment one starts to combine these mental models and attach one's experiences to them, one cannot help but gain what he calls worldly wisdom. And so kind of like this concept from Charlie Munger. I read Poor Charlie's Almanac years ago, but the idea of as you're adding things to your slip box, you're internalizing some of these ideas because you're spending time with them and you're understanding them, they become part of you. So he advocates for collecting these mental models as a way to grow. I would just caution against that, to, again, tailor or focus on this just-in-time learning idea rather than just broadly collecting stuff. But that's when you're reading something, you might come across something else that not directly related to what you're doing, but it's useful. So you capture that as you go. But I think having the intention with a goal in mind makes for your reading and learning more interesting, as we discussed kind of earlier. The book continues. When we delegate the storage of knowledge to the slip box and at the same time on the principles behind an idea while we write, add, and connect notes, when we look for patterns and think beyond the most obvious interpretation of a note, when we try to make sense of something, combine different ideas, and develop lines of thought, we do exactly that. We build up a latticework of mental models instead of just remembering isolated facts and try and bang them back. Again, connection, understanding. That's how you make use of ideas. I think that's going to be the TLDR of this video that we're going to open with. Section 12.5. Use the slip box as Section 12.5. Use the slip box as a creativity machine. Our fascination with these stories clouds the fact that all good ideas need time. The stories he's referring to are things like the flash of insight great scientists or discoveries have. But the thing is, these stories are interesting because they seem to happen in an instant, but really, even sudden breakthroughs are usually preceded by a long, intense process of preparation. Most often, innovation is not the result of a sudden movement of realization anyway, but incremental steps toward improvement. Even groundbreaking paradigm shifts are most often the consequence of many small moves in the right direction instead of one big idea. This is why the search for small differences is key. It is such an important skill to see differences between seemingly similar concepts or connections between seemingly different ideas. Yeah. Okay. So I like this section a lot now because like there's totally that sort of like give yourself, and this comes back to this idea of rest, but this idea of having deliberate rest as well as deliberate work is another concept. I don't think he's mentioning it there, but it's similar to like letting your subconscious or letting your brain work on things in the background. Small steps, iterative improvements. That's how you do big things. It's not all at once. And I think that's why sometimes big projects get overwhelming, is because you're not doing the next thing. And that's a weakness of mine that I've had, where it's easy to get caught up in the 10, 20 year step plan or 20-year plan, instead of thinking of like, what can I do today? What's the next smallest experiment I can run? I think that's a key idea here. Oh, and then related to that, something I didn't really gloss over when it comes to understanding and making the connections is like looking at the differences, like understanding the differences when making connections. I think that's a good point. All right, so now continuing, problems rarely get solved directly anyway. Most often, the crucial step forward is to redefine the problem in such a way that an already existing solution can be employed. The first question should always be directed towards the question itself. What kind of answer can you expect from asking a question in this particular way? What is missing? I think that's coming back to maybe the outside perspective a little bit. I'm not sure what else maybe resonated there, but starting like solving the right what's, I think that's important too. Like it's easy to stay busy, but are you working on the right problem in the first place? A clear structure allows us to explore the internal possibilities of something. Even the act of breaking with convention depends on it. The limitation of the canvas does not make the artistic expression of painters seem limited, but opens up the possibility of an artist like Lucio Fontana to cut into the canvas instead of painting on it. So having structure, like having structure and limitations, like I've heard that somewhere else too, where like the constraints lead to creativity. So I think that's just an idea they're mentioning here. Chapter 13 now, share your insight. And I have this related to why I write, my note up here. Writing itself makes you realize where there are holes in things. Coming back, just, that's the part of the quote I have highlighted. Again, the writing for understanding, the Feynman technique. Section 13.3, getting things done by following your interests. Now, this is like, this has been big into trusting this intuition and the energy, something I've been trying to do more of before. But the idea, like, I'm not even going to read a section of this book. I just have a note here in the margin. Follow your interests, take notes on what you're learning. Can't read that part. Oh, connect the note, of course, and then find gaps in what you don't know. But therefore, develop your interests along the way. It would be quite sad if we did not change our interests while we were researching. The ability to change the direction of our work opportunistically is a form of control that is completely different from the attempt to control the circumstances by clinging to a plan. Again, trust yourself, trust your intuition, trust that pull, that energy you have. That's a big thing in Jungian psychology that I've been reading a lot about too. Just trust like what's giving you energy or what you're excited by. I know it's hard with the constraints of work and life, but I think that's the idea or the freedom you get by doing things from the bottom up here with your second brain. Right. And so continuing in chapter 13 here, have the structure, but keep it flexible. It's vital to have a separate project specific place to sort your notes for a particular project. Try working on different manuscripts at the same time. So again, having structure, but flexibility, it all comes up here around doing what's easy. If you're working on multiple things, but you have the structure to keep them organized and separate, you can bounce around. I do that quite a bit. For a while, I thought that was wrong, but I love it. This is the way I like to work. So keep the structure flexible. This is a note I have. Keep the structure flexible. Work on multiple things. Totally fine. And now again, continuing in chapter 13, you're becoming an expert by giving up planning. Again, trust yourself. The planning skills of students are pathetic. People realistically underestimate all the time, what they're going to get done. That's what he talks about in this section. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Head to bitsofchris.com, subscribe, whatever. Share. What did you learn from this book? Did you like this book? What other books should we read? Again, this book has been really powerful, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was useful to you. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Take care. I'll see you in the next one.